Hey, audience. So glad to have you back with us today. We have a guest interview, which again are some of our favorite interviews. We have such a good time getting to know other brilliant people. I guess that kind of sounds like I'm saying we're brilliant too, though, so that's awkward. But other people who can bring amazing things to the table for us to explore together. So let me tell you about our guest today. And he has a really cool last name that I'm going to try to get right. It's Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski. He's a researcher and educator who focuses on the social emotional well-being of adolescents and understanding the role. This is his research and his work, understanding the role that gender plays in that equation, particularly masculinity. His research, PhD research from the University of Edinburgh, investigated teenage boys' experiences and beliefs about being male, and compared their experiences based on their level of emotional expression. He uses he's a mixed methods researcher, and he believes very strongly in positive, focused, and person-centered research that humanizes and empowers participants, as well in research that is transformative and practically useful for people in the real world, which is why we are talking to him right now. He is from and lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, and has 3 kids. And prior to his PhD, he was a high school teacher. So that is our guest today. Welcome, Brendan.
Thanks so much for having me.
So good to have you, and I'm excited for this conversation because I think it's an important topic to discuss in this season of the world. There's so much talk about what is a healthy man, what is masculinity, what is a man being too feminine or too emotional. and I feel like we're moving in the right direction, away from the stone wall hard push through it, but there's still a lot of misunderstandings and progress that we can make. So I'm really excited to have you on here, hear about your research and what you have to say about this topic of healthy masculinity, which you actually have a different, what is it? You have a different word for toxic masculinity, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I don't use the term toxic masculinity primarily because I don't feel like it's the most accurate description of what I think is going on. And so the term I use is restrictive masculinity. And the reason why I argue that is that the research shows like the 3 most harmful beliefs about masculinity that some people have that contribute to like the worst health outcomes for men, like mental health issues, suicide ideation, or it creates the most likely outcomes for harm for others, like dominance, violence against women, things like that, is a combination of these 3 beliefs, which are the need to restrict your emotions, the need to be self-reliant, and the need to be dominant. And I don't generally, I'm not going to defend the dominant one, which I would say is different than being assertive or confident. Like, and being a leader, an empathetic leader is great. But like, if you have this belief that like you must be in control of others, that is very problematic. But the other 2 that have a lot of negative outcomes for men and for others, like the need to be self-reliant and the need to restrict your emotions, is that I see toxic masculinity getting thrown like it's toxic to tell boys not to cry. When my research and like just the research about emotions is that there is context-dependent things at stake when you're talking about emotions. Like, when is it okay? It's like, it is very beneficial and strategic to restrict your emotions at certain times. It is very strategic and beneficial to be able to be self-reliant in situations, because like in school systems, like we want kids to be self-reliant or independent thinkers and things like that. So that's positive. But my issue sometimes with toxic masculinity as a term is that as I interviewed the most emotionally restricted boys in the school district I was researching, it would be very difficult to say that like, oh, their lack of emotional expression is toxic. Because the three main reasons for restricting their emotions was fear of judgment from others, primarily their male peers, but that was tied with the fear of being a burden to others. So let's say their parents divorced and they were saying things to me like, my parents are going through enough stuff. I don't need to add on my problems to their problems. So I am going to diminish my own emotional needs for the sake of others in my life. And there's not enough nuance in the term toxic masculinity to address that. I would counter argue my own thing is that like where I've seen the most pushback about my reticence to use the term toxic masculinity is they think of like people like Andrew Tate who like very clearly say like you can't be a man without being sexist. Like those things are intrinsically connected, would be like, yeah, I say that would be a good argument for describing like that would be toxic. But the way I view it is that like a masculinity that places rigid restrictions on how you must be or how others must be. That was when beliefs around masculinity become harmful. So I say the core or the root is restrictive masculinity, and then down the line that can lead to toxic behavior. There's a really good quote by Rupi Kaur. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of her, but I think this sums it up, and I'll paraphrase her poem. It's like 2 lines, but I think this describes when masculinity becomes harmful. And she's saying it not in masculine context. She's saying it in like a trauma perspective. But the poem is, we were in survival mode long after we needed to be. And I think that speaks to like restrictive masculinity, I would say, is almost always started in a survival adaptation way. And the problem becomes when you think that's rigid and you don't realize, hey, there actually might be people in your life that are safe to express with, and you can see those benefits, or it actually might be safe enough to let go of control and to be vulnerable with letting people into your life. And then, you do open up yourself to some potential for pain, but you also, if you minimize your ability to experience like sadness and fear, it also limits your ability to experience joy and happiness. And so you're missing out on a full experience. But I do have a lot of understanding for people who are in survival mode situations or who think they are. And those sometimes overlap and sometimes they don't.
Oh, wow. I love
this aligns so much with our work, doesn't it?
I just love how you explained all of that. And the language we would use is restrictive masculinity is an adaptation to trauma. So they're, like you said, their nervous system isn't feeling safe. So if it's not safe to have emotions, if having emotions isn't going to get your needs met, connection, relationship, attachment, then it's actually maladaptive to do that. And so rather than saying like that's toxic, that's actually like the way you're explaining this is, it's not toxic, it's an adaptation and survival that goes a lot deeper than just a behavior modification or even a cultural misunderstanding, but it goes into trauma healing. And even at the end, you were just talking about not using this language, but basically attachment. Like you're going to let people in, but the reason why they don't let people in is because relationship isn't safe. Relationship isn't welcoming those emotions, those parts of them. It's not safe to, like you mentioned, it's not, you're going to cry and be judged. That's attachment. Or I'm going to cry or have emotions and be a burden. That's attachment.
100%. And if you don't mind me interrupting,
go ahead.
The interesting thing with my comparison between the boys who are the most emotionally expressive and the boys who are the least is that the boys who are the least, yeah, definitely fear judgment from others, but because they restricted their emotions, they didn't describe any experiences of actually being judged from others for their emotions. So in one say, yeah, in one case, that's like very strong evidence that it works. However, they don't necessarily know that they're going to be judged for those things. Whereas the boys that are the most emotionally expressive, they've had more minor negative experiences, especially early adolescence, where like, oh yeah, they question my sexuality, like trying to diminish me for being more emotionally expressive. But that's just like a minor side of things. And most of the boys said like they've been surprised that there was less judgment when they actually went out and actually tried being emotionally vulnerable with certain people. And I think that's one of the things that I would love boys and men to understand, is that so many boys were talking to me about the exact same experiences, like, oh, I wish my male friends would just open up even once and having vulnerable conversations, and being like, I'm so lonely, even though I have lots of friends, but like I'm lonely at the heart level. And it's like I'm seeing like all these boys describing, or a lot of these boys describing like the same experiences. And I have a strong enough belief in my research and other research that like chances are there's another male peer in your group, and this applies to adults as well, that like wouldn't mind opening up more and having that sort of relationship.
Absolutely.
But it does create fear, because there's another research that says the only thing kind of worse than not sharing about your emotions with other people is if people have a negative response. And if they don't know how to hold someone's emotions, like they turn it all about them, being like, oh, your distress makes me distressed, so I'm going to minimize that. That's another thing to contend with. I'm sure you face that in your work with people not being able to hold space for other people's emotions.
Yes, absolutely. And there is some research, but this is also just observations, that a lot of times we learn at a young age to not have emotions, not because like a parent was making fun of them or ridiculed them, but like the first 2 years you learn about you build your attachment. And so if you cry and your parents aren't able to attune, then that is an implicit memory that emotions are a burden and won't receive relationship. So then they grow up into be adolescents, and it's not like, oh, I've got loads and loads of memories of being mocked for crying, but it's an implicit memory from infancy, that this isn't going to get me my needs met or connection. And so there's that schema that goes in our minds to adapt, to keep us safe, in order, based on our experiences, how relationships and connection works. And so I think that is complementary to what you're just saying. It's fascinating that there's not actual experiences. It's just an implicit feeling that this is going to happen. I am going to be let down. I'm going to be missed. I'm going to be left hanging with my emotions, or it's going to be a burden. Like when I was crying, my mom didn't come get me because it was too much, or she tried to, as we rock our kids, try to keep them quiet. Stop crying. Why are you crying? Like we remember those. We have those implicit memories, and so it's just fascinating that how your research is just reaffirming, like as a child, those messages just stick with us.
And then,
implicitly even.
like you said, even more risky on top of that, because that perception is already there, like that's already been conditioned.
Right.
Those neural pathways are there. So then when you do decide to share and like take that risk and throw something out there to a friend that maybe you think you're getting close to, and they make it all about themselves, or they don't get it, that, they don't have the capacity to hold space for it, then it almost like cements it, right? To just be so true that it's not safe to be emotional. so even more shut down you become, I'm imagining.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's reaffirms their fears. And it's interesting talking to this conversation is also why most boys felt most comfortable sharing with girls,
Girls.
because they felt like there's less judgments and they were better listeners, which brings up a whole other kind of gender dynamics of like kind of viewing girls or women as like this certain role, which these boys were very appreciative of. But it also begs the question of like how much does that kind of just reiterate certain
Yes.
norms about like women are just naturally nurturers and
Mhm.
carers, or do they just have more experience using emotional language? Like there's research that parents who have fathers and daughters, or sorry, parents who have sons and daughters, have found to be using more emotional language when talking to their daughters about events than talking to their sons, particularly around sad things.
Yep.
So I'm never, like, my background's actually in biology in my undergrad, and I really place a high value in biology as well. And so I don't want to say that like everything is socialized, but there's a huge body of research that socialization impacts our relationship with emotions so much, because the biological research about boys and emotions is that boys actually have greater emotional reactivity in response to stimuli than girls do. But boys report it and men report it consistently less, even though their body nervous system is actually more activated.
So like what you're just saying about the socialization is I find to be experientially true. I hear men so much just saying, just my wife just is better at that, or women just speak that language, or that's just how they are. And in conversations I have with them is like, is it that's how they are, or they've been given an environment to grow and nurture those characteristics and those emotions? Because as guys, we're told don't have emotions, whether it's implicitly or explicitly. Um, I mean, John Wayne isn't. We don't have John Wayne movies anymore, but that kind of mentality still shows in our media. And then coming from those generations, our parents didn't like. I saw my dad cry maybe once in my life. My mom, I've seen cry many times. And so there's that, again, implicit or just experiential, that if we're told that that's what's acceptable and safe and good, then our bodies are going to lean towards that way. And we're going to have those continued reaffirmed biases of, yeah, like my friends do this, my dad does this, I do this, they get made fun of on TV. So yeah, it's just, I see that socially very much, that women are given the space to build that capacity for emotion rather than just naturally gifted in it.
And I want to add two pieces of more nuance to that discussion, because I love that. One is that identified in my research, there's two types of adherence to masculine norms, like to restrict their emotions, to be physically tough.
Okay.
One of those was those who willingly adhered to it. So they were being like, okay, this is what I think a man needs to be, so this is what I'm going to try to become, and I think this has more benefits, and maybe I don't even see any negatives in it. Whereas a large number, I call them reluctant adherers, is that they've realized that, like, okay, I don't actually necessarily want to be this way, but I think that the costs of being emotionally sensitive are too great, like social ostracization and things like that. So I feel stuck, but this is the thing that probably ensures that I have the best path forward with like friends and social dynamics and things like that.
Yeah.
But what none of those boys said is that none of them ever claimed that they've always just been emotionally unexpressive. Like they all remembered when and or approximately and why they started to restrict their emotions. So none of them are saying that this is the way that I am biologically or naturally. They all recognize that they were very emotional and have this emotional part to themselves, but have had to actually actively work at suppressing it. So it's not like we always hear about like boys are just innately this way, or that's often the argument. But these boys themselves
Are
don't
not saying that.
subscribe to that. They're like, I need to work
Yeah.
on being that way, even if they believe that is what men should be. It's like, that's what I'm trying to become. And so that's one bit of nuance. And another bit of nuance is that there's also an impression that I had this stereotype or assumption going into my research, is that I thought that if you're more emotionally restricted, you might be very emotionally illiterate and or like have a low emotional intelligence.
Sure.
I was definitely surprised at the level of the highest emotionally restricted boys who were able to articulate what was going on for them. Like they were so aware of their emotions in some ways, just maybe they haven't felt it, but they were very aware. Like you have to be very conscious of your emotions to know that you don't want to be a burden to other people and that you notice other people's emotional states and it's not safe. So they're, I would argue, like almost more emotionally attuned to other people's emotions. And one of the the boy who was the most emotionally restricted, according to like the test or the screening tool I used, he was like, yeah, I know that probably years down the road, because I haven't felt all these things, that I'm gonna like maybe like explode one day in anger, or something small will just set me off. And I know that that probably will happen. And like that articulation about it, I think hopefully should at least challenge people's assumptions that boys are like emotionally illiterate, or that they don't have emotional some emotional capacity. Because there's also another study that like had men and women identify emotions, like I can't remember exactly it, but all I know is that there was a gender difference, that girls were better, or women were better than the men at identifying emotions and faces or something like that, until they offered the men money, and then the men scored the same amount as the woman. I need to refine this study.
That's
Because
interesting.
yeah, so there's a lot of nuance to that, because I do want to also reiterate that the less practice you have with naming and feeling emotions, it will lead you more likely to like not know how to navigate emotions effectively, and that does lead to harm. But I do push back against the notion that men or boys are less emotionally intelligent.
Absolutely.
There's so many complexities to that.
Yeah, again, 100% agree with that. Go ahead, Lauren.
I'm just curious, the metric you used to assess emotional restriction, like what types of questions were you asking to be able to tell who was restricted and who wasn't? Like, can you just give us an example of that?
Yeah, so it's not like I use a scale that's been developed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term alexithymia. Alexithymia is like a DSM, like my PhD research was very much in between sociology and psychology. So I use a psychological criteria that alexithymia is like technically a diagnosable condition of your inability, and they don't actually know how much is the inability to express your emotions versus your willingness to express your emotions. And I would say my research definitely identifies it's way more willingness than inability. And so the definition has both. There's like willingness and or inability to express emotions or put emotions into words. I think the original of the Greek for alexithymia means without words for. So not having words to express your emotions. And I've definitely done social emotional interventions for teenage boys with behavioral disorders. And when I led those interventions and had counselors come in, we did realize that like the emotional language of just like what are feelings, what are emotions, what's the purpose of emotions, like there is a lot of education to do around those topics. An example of one of the questions would be something like, I have people in my life that I can express I have close friends I can express my feelings with, and like rate on a scale of 1 to 7. So that would be one of the domains.
Okay.
So it's kind of a combination of like how much access or willingness do you have to talk to people, but there's also questions about
How much you use those resources.
Yeah, like how much do you actually feel like you're able to do those things.
Wow.
It's really interesting the conversation you're having with adolescents and how much insight they have. I don't work with adolescents, I work with adults. And so the longer we get disconnected from our emotions, we become more and more disembodied, which we become more and more separated from language, from those emotions, from identifying them, from interacting with them, from feeling safe with them. So it's interesting that a lot of the men that I work with have basically this 100% believe like I'm inept. I can't show emotions. I can't identify emotions. I can't communicate what I'm feeling or even empathize, like identify what my spouse is feeling or partner is feeling. And it's like, and so it's just really fascinating to hear the insight of teenagers who, again, kind of get this rep of like not being emotionally intelligent, being disrespectful, being like all of these things. And we have a 15-year-old, and I think I'd agree, like he is very emotionally intelligent, like
sometimes shockingly so.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes our jaws just drop. I'm gonna actually give an example. It won't be an embarrassing thing to him, but we were getting haircuts the other day, and in Thailand, females who there's a term called a tom, and it's a female whose I believe orientation would be like lesbian. They dress more looking like a traditional boy. And so the person who was cutting his hair was a tom, and I'm sitting there and he's like, he keeps saying she's doing it like this, and her and she, and he's using this pronoun, and I'm like, shoot, are toms referred to as females in Thai culture? So I'm kind of starting to panic, and I like text a few friends. I'm like, do we say she or they? And I didn't know if pronouns are even something that's really gotten into, having a more neutral pronoun. I didn't know if that was common in Thailand yet.
Well, so I just Thai language is a lot more, doesn't have a lot of these specific pronouns that English has.
So he keeps saying this, and when we leave, I'm like, hey buddy, I don't know if we would refer to the person as a she. Maybe just say they next time. And he's like, Mom, I just listened and she said ka. In the Thai language, you end sentences with ka if you're female or kap if you're male. And so when you hear someone talk, you can hear how they're referring to themselves. And I didn't even consider that. Like that wasn't even on my radar. He's like, Mom, as soon as I heard her say ka, then I started saying she. And I was just like, just so blown away at his in the moment insightfulness and resourcefulness that like this grown woman sitting over here talking to a bunch of grown woman friends couldn't even think of, all in Thailand. Like these were all Thai people in Thailand that are expats here. So just like there's so many moments like that where Luke and I will look at each other and we're like, wow, there is such a depth of insight and emotional awareness here that we discount sometimes and don't recognize.
Definitely.
Yeah. So that is a very socially, emotionally nuanced interaction that you were just explaining, Lauren.
That he picked up on. Yeah, totally. And that happens so often. So I love that your research shows that, and like to bring more honor and to rehumanize our perception of these young men and men as well, and actually have a higher view of them than just assuming that they're incompetent to this world, this emotional world.
Yeah, one of the saddest quotes from my research personally was the boy in grade 12 who said, like, I'm starting to forget about my emotional self.
Wow.
And that is a high level of awareness. But I think about, like you said, you work like with men, is that they're definitely, I'm curious and I have my own assumptions.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, if you stay disconnected for a long time, then it's harder to access that. There's more unlearning and relearning that has to go in. Whereas if they're able to maintain a connection within themselves or with a small select few people throughout, that definitely has huge benefits.
So a lot of the foundation of the work we do is having the lens of being trauma informed and abuse informed. And that's taken, the trauma informed took a lot of time, and then adding on the abuse informed lens has taken a lot of work for us personally to really understand power dynamics, what oppression is, what it looks like, how abuse can manifest itself in so many different ways, not just physical. And so that's really important to us. And we want to be really careful to, bringing this conversation to these teen boys that then grow up to be adults, and then the choices that they make and the way that they choose to live their lives. We want to be really mindful of how we view these abusive behaviors that men typically throughout history have been the ones to primarily perpetuate. And so I guess my question for you would be, what is the difference between coddling men and looking at, their trauma and their wounds and that, and like almost that becoming an excuse for the ways they hurt others, versus what you want to do and what your work does for teens and then beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question with so much there. The first response that I can think of is that like when you're dealing with trauma and like abuse situations, like there's understanding for there's compassion, understanding for people's trauma and their socializations, and how that has played out in their lives.
Yeah.
And in terms of like, even if they are the perpetrators, like there's a wounded little boy inside that has been dehumanized or disembodied for a long time, and that deserves compassion. But definitely like not at the expense, or like depends on the context and the situation, not at the expense of sometimes there's definitely a lot of public cases where very quick to forgive often male perpetrators in positions of power, or to excuse it as biology, like, oh, it's men's sexual drive or something like that. One, very clearly, the focus needs to be on the victim. Like, just because you're not responsible for the hurt that you've experienced, but you are responsible for the hurt you've caused. And so like we're all responsible for our own healing. Even though some of us have been dealt a terrible hand. My wife is a trauma therapist, and like I grew up, I think everyone grows up with trauma of their own, but like there's way more people growing up in way more trauma than I ever imagined as a kid growing up in relative safety. And so I know people have been dealt like horrendous hands in life but you're still responsible for how that impacts other people. And so I do think it's important for men to have, or like in this, for perpetrators of abuse to be given understanding. And there's a doctor that I really like how he differentiates it, and I'll try to do it justice. His name is Dr. Frank Anderson. He's really big into IFS
Yeah.
therapy, and I don't think he used it in this context. So, but he differentiates compassion and empathy, and that often, like, people in more positions of power, of, like, let's say men as abusers, are deserving of compassion, which is more like there's a bit more of a boundary of, like, understanding your position, but I'm not going to be just so there alongside you in maybe you're feeling like, I see your shame, and shame can often go two ways. I find one way, I call spiraling shame, which is your shame for doing something hurtful. Let's say you get called out for abuse, your shame was like, oh, I am bad. And then you can spiral into that being like, I'm worthless. Like, I'll just, like, oh, I can't do anything right. But then it makes it all about you. And again, the victim is being missed.
Right.
So there's no accountability there. It actually makes it more about you. And then the other term is, my friend, a therapist, Gabs Torres, she taught me about transformational shame, is that shame can also be like, what is the benefit, evolutionary benefit of shame? It's like, it's a very effective way of changing behavior, like, but often in a very harmful way. But if you can take on shame, because maybe you did something bad, but can you learn and grow from that? And then the focus can get more on the other person and how you've hurt the other person. So I think that as a society, we definitely need to balance compassion for even abusers, but I'm never going to tell someone who's been hurt that they need to have compassion or they need to do anything like that. But, like, empathy is the coming alongside and, like, seeing people in their pain, and, like, so more, I would differentiate slightly more compassion focused for the perpetrators and empathy focused for victims. And Dr. Frank Anderson says it better in a podcast.
I think that's really appropriate for this aspect of the conversation. And I think, again, back to socialization, so many women, because we're socialized to care, to hold the burdens of our male counterparts, we end up not recognizing that you can hold the compassionate view towards someone who is abusing you or your children or whatever, whether it be a partner, a boss, whatever. You can hold that because you understand, a lot of these people will get really into trauma work and then they're like, oh, well, that person's traumatized too. That's why they're doing this. And then they'll take on that burden of, well, then I need to help, like, heal with them. I need to help them heal. And so they enter back into the empathy. I'm going to partner with you in this, when really that dynamic is not safe for that person, for the victim. And it doesn't mean that person isn't worthy of healing. They are just as much worthy to go on their own path, but it doesn't need to be the victim who is the co-regulating empathetic witness to their story.
100%. And that's the huge dynamic that we talked about earlier, about how women are also often function as emotional safe havens. So, like, in an abusive relationship where the male is the abuser, it's like they might be used to getting their emotional needs met primarily from the partner, and that dynamic has to completely be deconstructed.
Yes.
And there's a book called Rage Becomes Her that I think women's anger has been shut down so much in society that I think so many women need to express, like, deep rage, and that needs to be honored. I think of, like, on a societal level, there's always be exceptions, but, like, I think if we understood women's rage more, or just, like, felt it and witnessed it without maybe trying to fix it, without trying to diminish it or anything, then that would be a good step forward to healing. And I think we have a complicated relationship with anger in general. Like, men and women have socialized kind of different things. I know a lot of the boys I talk to are, like, afraid of their anger. Like, they are actually feel like, I was playing rugby and I actually hurt a kid. I'm aware of how my body can be intimidating and hurtful of others. Like, they don't know what to do with anger. and then a lot of women are taught to suppress it as well, and to like understand that like emotions in and of themselves are neutral, like are there just natural processes, but like how we ascribe meaning to that and how we enact that can definitely cause harm or be helpful. But just like expressing rage and feeling anger, I want to honor that in people's stories. And I also want to honor the, like, I want to honor that, like, the parts of people that do terrible things. I grew up and used to think that, like, okay, we need to like battle and like fight those parts.
Right.
And yes, it is like an inner battle, but definitely my philosophy and in my own personal journey is that if I can actually extend compassion to these parts that have caused pain, which I thought I would never do. Like, why would I ever want to have compassion for these parts that hurt other people or hurt me? But I can tell you that healing wasn't happening by just suppressing those and trying to conquer it, but getting to know it has been the most transformational thing. But that can sometimes feel like you're letting people off the hook. It's like, what if I actually have compassion for these bad things or perpetrators? Like, that means that, like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean I'm not as justified in my anger? And like, I want to say no, but it is a complicated healing process.
Complicated. And that's where being such binary thinkers gets us in trouble, because it doesn't have to be either or. We were watching a video the other day, and it was prisoners teaching tapping. It was like they have a page. I'm not sure who does it, but the prisoners had learned if you're not watching, I'm tapping on my face. EFT is the name of it, right, Luke? Where you tap, and it's essentially a regulating process, and it's really can be really beneficial for anxiety and for expressing emotions. And they're doing it, they're in their jumpsuits, and I'm showing my kids, and they're like, just kind of like, but you could tell their wheels were turning. And I was just telling them, like, in my vision of the world, this is what it would be. There are consequences for your choices. What you did is not socially acceptable, so you have to serve this sentence, blah. And you get to be rehabilitated, and you get to
you
find
still matter.
Restoration, because what led you to these choices is inevitably harm, your own hurt, your own wounds. And then the complex way genetics can play into that, but there's stories of harm behind that. And now you are paying this sentence, but you're also finding recovery and rehabilitation. And I know there's models that are more like that, especially in some European countries, but I think that would be a beautiful way to, like you said, let someone face the justice system and the right response to what they've done on a justice level. But then also, why would we not want people to actually heal so they don't continue to reoffend and cause harm in this world to themselves and to others? Like, why would that ever be a negative thing?
And that's why I love IFS, that theory so much, is because it brings that, it takes it from a binary to a nuance of the language of what these parts are, how they're helping you find safety is not okay, but their desire for safety is okay. So let's look at that nuance of, okay, there's compassion for why you've taken this pathway, because you're trying to meet a real need, but is there another way to do that?
So Brendan, I was just gonna kind of go towards like your vision for men and what this could look like, anything in that direction. Do you have any thoughts there before I actually ask you that question?
Like, I've gone through a gambit in my own history of researching masculinity, of sometimes being, I think I'm often bent towards optimism and hope, but I've definitely
Mhm.
felt moments like nothing's going to change,
Yeah.
or I've gone through different ebbs and flows, but I actually do have a lot of hope, and I want to lean into what gives me hope. And where I don't feel hope often is like on a lot of internet conversations
Mm.
around it,
Right.
around topics, but like actual face-to-face interactions with
Yes.
people who even disagree with me about things. Like I actually really I'm okay with that, and I actually really like conversations with people that disagree with me. Um, and in my work with boys, like, and all my research with the boys is that like even boys who've been expelled for behavior that needs to have consequences have been some of the most vulnerable boys as well. Like people aren't these binaries of toxic versus non-toxic.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so here's my wish list. I wish that every boy growing up, or every man growing up, um, could have one adult or even older elder as a role model and mentor, whether that's a parent or something else. I do think it's not necessary exclusively for it to be a male, but I think having a male positive role model would be high on my wish list.
Yeah.
And that this role model would be someone that is confident enough in their own processing of like their identity, of how they are, and they would also just be a safe space um, for that boy growing up. And the second wish list item is that I wish that each boy could have one friend that they could be honest about how they actually think about things. Because there's a famous um, or a famous sociologist named Dr. Michael Kimmel, who he argues that most boys and men aren't. I don't. He didn't use the word toxic, but I'm saying this bluntly. That most boys and men aren't toxic or bad, but most are complicit bystanders. So like we're talking about locker rooms or things like that.
Yeah.
And it's like I do think that there's a lot of boys out there that see injustice and don't say things from a protective kind of survival adaptation way. But I also know that there's multiple boys likely in those locker rooms thinking the same thing. So having even one person to be like, to be on your side helps so much if you have one friend to go through things. So that'll be my wish list for people. Obviously, that's um, impossible to ensure, but my vision for masculinity or like gender relations is that I'm describing it this way: is that if you look at what masculinity and femininity mean in most cultures, like if you break it down, the two for men and women, or two for masculinity and femininity that are most commonly cited in the research is like men as protectors and providers, and women as caregivers and nurturers. And I would like to expand that by looking a bit deeper. So, like, if we look at men masculinity being protectors and providers, so often it's just focused on the physical protection. But I would like to expand that a bit further and be like, can you provide emotional safety for yourself and for others? And you provide accountable, can you make people feel safe by being accountable for your actions? So for me, what it comes down to is that protecting and provision, I ultimately think that having positive definitions of masculinity is helpful, is to be like, what's the core of them? I would answer safety. Is that a healthy, quote unquote, healthy masculinity is one that is safe for people. And protecting and providing can be those ways. But then I'll also say, like, look at the femininity of caregivers and nurturers. Like, that is also safety as well. Like, and I think, like, in therapy, like, I forget what modality of it is, but like one of the stages in a certain type of therapy is like the first stage is safety and stabilization before you can do a lot of work with people. Like, establishing safety is really important. So
Absolutely.
I think that focusing on whether you really like the terms masculinity and femininity, whether you think those things don't actually exist and they're only social constructs, and like androgyny, however you want to conceptualize it. My vision is that masculinity and femininity is one that embodies a sense of safety.
I love that.
We can definitely get on board with that vision. That is, we have a whole week for it in our programs when we work with people is safety. What is safety? How to reconnect to safety for yourself and cultivate more safety, and then how to be safe for others, because it's like it's the currency of relationships, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not bringing that through your masculinity or through your femininity, what are you bringing, I guess, is the question. Like, if it's not safe, then
What is it?
yeah, that it could be so many things that are not going to be relationally, societally beneficial if safety is not the foundation.
You're not going to be giving those safety cues or connection to the people around you.
Yeah.
If you're not
And
safe.
if I could just like touch in, there's so many interesting conversations to have, because we could talk about like the nice guy syndrome, about guys who think like they're nice, and and I would assess that and saying that they think of themselves as safe. Like, I'm not like these chads or whatever that they call these bad, like these, I don't know, jock type guys. Struggling to find words for that. But I would say that they, like, the thing about being a nice guy is not like an inner sense of safety, because it's not like they know themselves and that they're confident in who they are, so it doesn't matter. It's like, no, they are trying to play a certain role to get a girl, maybe in that case, and it's not working out. And so it's not a sign of like mature masculinity or just mature adulthood. It's like wanting something from your behaviors. Like, it's more transactional. I wouldn't call that safe, although a lot of nice guys might think that they're being safe.
Right.
That's a really good point.
That is a really good differentiation between safe and just nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's all boils down to that inner work. Like, again, this is so much deeper than behaviors. And masculinity, in a sense, is like a study of behaviors, but really, like, what you're drawing people to is that heart level, and anything on the outside, if it's not just a genuine overflow of what's on the inside, is going to be short term, and it's gonna, like the classic story of the girl getting married to this awesome guy, and he's so sweet and blah, 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 and then he got what he wanted and they're married, and that facade just melts away and there's his true self. So going back to that actual true like representation of someone internally, which is where I think there needs to be a lot of growth as a society, because we've been so behavior focused. So
externally focused,
driven by that. Externally focused. And
I would say that, like, the research has shown in the last 30 years, the ability for women to branch out and explore, like, their roles once were very restricted, homemakers, blah, 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 realizing, wait, those aren't necessarily fulfilling for everyone. Can I step up more? Like, the research showing, like, women and girls are their girl box has expanded, whereas man boxes has stayed relatively consistently the same over the last 30 years.
Interesting. Wow.
So that's why you get all of these polarizations of alt-right men movements that are like, no, women actually have it better now than boys do or men do. So there's lots of polarizations and complexities.
So those are your favorite comments, I'm sure, that you see, that men are like the most oppressed people group, like those types of things. You probably really enjoy talking with those men on social media.
On social media, not so much, but I really have an issue with not, like, obviously there's some trolls that are just trolling, but like,
sure,
I really haven't I like when people challenge my masculinity or something
Mm.
on social media, like one, it's relatively tame compared to my female colleagues who get like death threats and rape threats. Like I haven't gotten any of those, but like generally the go-to is like questioning my masculinity, calling me a soy boy or things like that. And it's like at one level, there's a part of me that's like wants to respond in like all these ways that I do actually fit a typical traditional masculinity in certain areas. But it's like I don't want to get to that level.
Right.
Because I do think that like easy to it's easy when you feel like you've been dehumanized by someone else, it's
Mm.
really easy to justify your dehumanization of them in response.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
I I do I where I feel like I am in life, I do want men that really deeply disagree with me to feel heard or seen at some level. And if that's by me, like I feel like I have some capacity to do that and I want to do that on social media, not always, but in person, definitely. Like
Yeah.
I hate the ivory tower academics that don't engage in like actual
Mm.
discourse. Like I'm in high schools frequently and I love how honest teenagers are. And if they disagree, like they'll call out your BS so quickly. And that is
Yes.
so good. I would hate it if when I was a teacher, if students like believed, or if they found out what my opinion was about something, and if they just believed it because I believed it, I would much prefer them to be like, oh, I hear what you're saying, but like I still believe this, even if it's
Mm.
something I wouldn't deem as like as healthy or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Being able to have that discourse or those conversations is another place where society can grow. Of like
Mhm.
disagreeing doesn't mean uh danger, or like that's where we get stuck in that binary. Is like, is it either I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm wrong and you're right, and I can't be wrong, so you must be wrong, so I have to be right. And
Yeah.
and it really polarizes us.
And I've been on social media too a couple times, way less, but one time like I would call radical feminist of like being not I'm not feminist enough or things like that. Like I've experienced
Mm.
that to a lesser degree. Just when I like asked challenged if something was like factual
Yeah.
or not, and
Mm.
it like the response was like it doesn't matter if it's factual or not, like it's us
Mm.
versus them mentality. And I think
Wow.
um I yeah, I think we go back to COVID or all these things where um people's pain and their
Yes.
protective and their fears were heightened that easily
Yeah.
made you lose other people's humanity as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I hope that
Yes.
I'm able to keep humanizing anyone that I engage with.
That's a
Mm.
beautiful desire.
I'd say part of my desire to not dehumanize other people is selfish because I just firmly believe that you can't dehumanize someone unless you've already dehumanized part of yourself. Like if you view that like yeah, I think that if you can turn against someone else, like you stop seeing the the inherent goodness. Like I would use like imago Dei.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you stop seeing the imago Dei in someone else. The only way to do that is because like you view that as something to separate yourself from. And I'm not sure if I'm
Yeah.
Mhm.
saying it clearly. Like this is a philosophical belief. Let me be clear that I personally hold,
Right.
not like a
Yeah.
research-based thing. But I
Yeah.
just know for me that dehumanizing other people is a
Mhm.
result of me polarizing and viewing parts of myself negatively.
I think
Mhm.
that makes a lot of sense. I think you said that really well. Um, and so, yeah, I appreciate you adding that, because I think that is a challenge and an invitation and a reminder of, again, like dehumanizing somebody is not good, but it's also a information and an invitation to look at, okay, what in me have I lost, or have I sacrificed, or if I dehumanized, that has allowed me to respond to that person that way.
Yes.
And I can, with that curiosity or that transformational shame, you can move forward and heal and learn and progress and evolve to be a more safe and safe person that validates and sanctions that humanity of other people. So I appreciate that work.
And we appreciate this time chatting with you.
Absolutely.
This is so good. And I feel like we've done a lot. We haven't really had someone on our podcast exploring masculinity. We haven't at all, actually. We've had conversations about like, what do healthy relationships look like and how to make them more equitable, but specifically talking about masculinity. And I just think it's such a brilliant idea, because we're going around like setting all these fires out all around us, and all of these really important issues that need tending to, that are primarily male perpetrated. And how about we also be like preventative and help men not have such a restrictive, help their masculinity not be so restrictive, so that it can actually grow. Actually, the other day, I totally forgot about this. Do you remember that, hon? We were at yoga. Luke and I do yoga together. And the yoga instructor, read this really beautiful poem. And I was like super connecting with it. And I was like thinking for a second, I wonder what Luke's thinking, because poetry hasn't really been a part of his like journey as a man. So I just had that quick thought. And as I'm laying there in a pose, listening to this poem, I'm kind of an empath. So I'm just like feeling all of this deep burden and weight for men and what they've missed out on because of socialization. It just like flooded me, and how much, I mean, even in the beginning, when you were saying those little quotes from the boys that you interviewed, like my heart just ached for them and what they've lost and what they've had to like put to death in themselves, what they've had to cut off. And I felt that in that moment, hearing that poem, and just like longing for something more for men who are just as worthy as women are, to have goodness and beauty and joy and wonder and delight and connection and all these words and things that the world is like, well, these are more for women, but it's just it's so unfair. So I think it's just really beautiful what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I can ramble on as well. So thanks for putting up with that as well.
It was a really great chat. And,
yeah, it was.
I hope you enjoyed this, audience. Please check out Brendan's work. He is at re.masculine.com. He's also on Instagram at re.masculine and TikTok at re.masculine. So check him out. I really like your reels where you talk and you explain things. Was showing my son them. And you also have your original work on your site, correct? That people can read. Okay. So yeah, check that out. And again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next episode.